Now we're going to discuss epithelial tissue. There are several types of epithelium, and we can classify them by shape and complexity. Two basic complexities: simple, which is single-celled layer I should say, and stratified, which is multiple cell layered. We have three basic shapes: squamous, which is flat, cuboidal, which is cube-shaped, and columnar, which is rectangular or column-shaped. When we name epithelial tissue, we usually go with complexity first and then shape second. So now we're going to do the simple epitheliums, and we're going to start with simple squamous epithelial tissue. Now notice simple squamous epithelial tissue is this tissue right up here. We have a nucleus here and a nucleus here, but we really can't see where the cells end and begin. So we're just going to have to kind of guess that. But nonetheless, we can appreciate that this cytoplasm is extremely flat. We have a pair of nuclei, and this makes it simple squamous epithelium. Let's see where it is, too. It's associated with a blood vessel. This is called a venule. So we find simple squamous epithelium associated with blood vessels. We find it associated with mesothelium, as well as the alveoli of the lungs. Let's go to simple cuboidal. Simple cuboidal epithelial tissue is cube-shaped. And so you can see, let's go back. You can see that these cells have kind of a cube-shaped feature, right? And underneath, whoops, let's do it again. Sorry about that. Underneath it, we have a basement membrane. Now, because this is relatively high power, this basement membrane is fairly obvious. But if you take a look down here, this is a very erratic looking tissue. This is irregular looking, lots of different cell types. And so this is connective tissue below. So again, we're looking at just a single layer of cells. The space in between here is referred to as the lumen. We find simple cuboidal tissue, epithelial tissue associated with tubes, I should say, and also with glands. Here's simple columnar epithelium. Now this particular tissue has cells that are columnar in nature. There's the nucleus and here's the cytoplasm. So I'm looking at one single cell right here. Notice too that these often are associated with tissues that elongate. So in this particular case, we're looking at villi in the small intestine. So this kind of finger-like appearance. Although if we did a cross-section of this, obviously you wouldn't see that. What you'd be looking for is a nucleus, oftentimes oval-shaped, with an abundance of cytoplasm on top. This is a very common tissue in the digestive system, also in the female reproductive system. Pseudostratified epithelium is tissue that is found in the respiratory tract predominantly, although it's also found in the epididymis of the male reproductive system. And this tissue looks like it's going to be stratified, but it is not, hence the name pseudostratified or falsely stratified. It's a tricky tissue, because if we were looking at an electron micrograph, we would be able to see that each of these cells would actually be in contact with the basement membrane down here. Almost impossible to see that under a light microscope. So at least for us, what we're looking for is cilia. There are very few tissues that are ciliated that are not pseudostratified epithelial tissue, and also most pseudostratified epithelial tissue is ciliated. So look at that. Look for the cilia. Here's another example, a little higher power. And again, we can see the cilia quite nicely here on top, making it pseudostratified epithelium. Stratified epithelial tissues, remember, have multiple layers. And when we name the stratified epithelial tissues, we only name it the tissue for the appearance as it is on the apical surface, if that makes any sense. So, in other words, the apical surface is the free end. Apical. Free. I don't want a pickle, I just want to ride on my motorcycle. Free end, right? Not the attached end. The attached end is where the basement membrane is going to be, and we could care less what those cells look like. We're only looking at the free end. Do you remember the pseudostratified epithelial tissue? Let's go back to it. See where the cilia are? That's where the free end is. All right, stratified squamous epithelium unkeratinized. Here we have an example of a tissue that is flat on the top, and we don't care what it is down here. It's flat on top, and as a result, we're going to call this stratified squamous. Notice that it's multiple layered, right? Multiple layers here, so not single layered, and flat on the surface. I want to go back to that first one. See how flat it is here? Nice and flat on the top here, right? Stratified squamous epithelium. And let's look at yet another example. Here we have it again, flat on the surface right here. And nobody cares about what's going on over here. This is going to be the basal end, and this is the apical end. We find stratified squamous epithelium in the inner lining of the mouth, the esophagus, and the anus. Stratified squamous epithelium keratinized is the tissue we find in the skin. Now, keratinized means that it is dead tissue. And so clearly on top here, this kind of wispy stuff, this is going to be dead cells, a collection of dead cells. And here we have a cell that's nice and flat because this is the apical surface. We're going to call this stratified squamous epithelium, and we could care less about the cells down here. Stratified cuboidal epithelial tissue is found in glandular tissues. It's also found in the ovary, specifically in the follicle. And we can see these cells here. Now, we would expect them to be cube-shaped. Wouldn't that be nice? They really aren't. They're kind of roundish. And so they're almost cuboidal by default because they're really not columnar, and they're certainly not flat. And so by default, we're going to call them cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, because they're multiple layers, right? These cells are also found in sweat glands. Stratified columnar epithelium is extremely rare. I don't find this very many places at all. In the area where the cornea of the eye meets the sclera, in the epiglottis, in certain regions of the epiglottis, and in the back of the iris, we find stratified columnar epithelial tissue. But look at these cells here. They're definitely columnar. Oops, go back. They're definitely columnar. And look at the cells below. They are more cuboidal, but we don't care because this is the free end, right? Free end. Stratified columnar, a very, very rare tissue. Finally, my nemesis tissue, hopefully not yours. This is transitional epithelium. Transitional epithelial tissue is found in the urinary system. So we find it in the renal pelvis. We find it in the ureter and the urethra. We find it in the urinary bladder. And as the name implies, this tissue can change shape. So here we have, we'll say maybe columnar appearance to the tissue, right? It's certainly multiple layers. And then here we have, of course, these nice big cells on top. Sometimes they are large cells that encompass more than one, in which case we call them the umbrella cells. Some people say this looks like a peacock's tail. Some people say it looks like spraying water. Regardless, this is a tissue that can be tricky, and I'll tell you why. Because when the bladder is full, this is what it looks like. This is the same tissue right here, transitional epithelium. You can see that there's some relatively broad cells on top here, though. And these broad cells are probably, again, the umbrella cells. Again, I don't think your teacher will be so mean as to make you learn this one, but nonetheless, that's just the way it is, right? So let's go back, and thank you very much for your time. Okay, so